Hello, everybody. Welcome this afternoon to the Langley Adams Library in Groveland, Massachusetts. A special shout out to Robert Hayes of Tewksbury Library, who is my technical support for this program. Do it without him. I really appreciate it. Our guest today is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, author, and preeminent mob historian. He's covered organized crime for more than 3 decades, and his books on the subject include the one we're going to talk about today, Broadway Butterfly, The Big Heist, Gangland, New York, King of the Godfathers, Mob Killer, Top Hoodlum, and Gotti's Boys. As a reporter specializing in criminal justice and legal affairs for Newsday for the past 30 years, Tony has covered major crimes and trials, including the Gilgo Beach serial killer, the reputed Gambino crime boss Peter Gotti, former Bonanno crime boss Joseph Messino, and the so-called mafia cops Bernard Madoff, and the Happy Land Social Club fire, among others. He lives in the New York metropolitan area. Please join me in welcoming our special guest today, Tony Destefano.
Oh, thank you, Sue, and thank you for that nice introduction. You hit those mobster names quite well, which is, for some people, it's no mean feat. Anyway, thank you all for coming in. The book we're talking about today is Vivian Gordon, The Lady Gangster of Jazz Age New York. Broadway Butterfly is the title. And it's about a woman, Vivian Gordon, who, well, as the slide may show you, knew too much in her life in Prohibition and Jazz Age New York. And she met an untimely end. She was murdered, and we're going to get into that as we progress. This title here, you see, She Knew Too Much, was actually the name of my presentation at the Mob Museum last month, which was the maiden voyage for the publicity for this book. But we'll just, forge ahead here. And she was born Benita Franklin, far cry from Vivian Gordon, in Indiana. And she was a Catholic girl who went to a convent school in Canada with her sisters. And she was one with musical and theatrical aptitude, but she was also very incorrigible. And she really dropped out of school and made her way to the East Coast of New York about 1914. And she eventually landed in Manhattan, where she got some small Broadway roles and did some modeling. She was, attractive young woman, and, she thought she could make a go of it. Here is a program from the Schubert organization. And as you see, at the very bottom is Vivian Gordon playing in their production for the time. This was in 1914. They really had a production that was trying to rival the Ziegfeld Follies. And this is where Vivian got some coverage. She got some play and she got some roles, nothing major. As you can see, she wasn't the big star, but she was, making her way. A lot of women in New York at that time, we're talking just about World War I, who were trying to make their way as actresses and models and whatnot. And it's very competitive, as it still is today, but she tried to do what she could do. Well, she did some modeling, and here's a modeling shot. And we found this in the New York City archives. It's not the greatest modeling shot, but, it shows her at the time. And like I said, she was somewhat attractive and was in competition with a lot of other women from modeling and other jobs. Well, not all of that worked very well. It wasn't a steady income. I think, as anybody in the theater profession will tell you today, it's, full-time employment gets very erratic. And that's what Vivian found. She changed her name to Vivian when she did her modeling and theatrical work. And that's what we'll stay with for the rest of the program here. She left her husband. She was married about 1920, and she was living in New York. And with work being skimpy, she got arrested on what she said was a trumped-up prostitution charge. And this was a common problem for women in New York City at that time. The cops were corrupt, the courts were corrupt, and they would get brought in on trumped up charges and basically told to, make it all go away by giving money or jewelry to the right people. This image here is the old Jefferson Market courthouse, where a lot of these women cases, prostitution cases, were tried and brought to court. It still exists today. It's a center landmark in Greenwich Village, but back then it was really where the women's court was. Vivian got sentenced, even though she claimed she was trumped up, and she got a 3-year sentence at a local state institution for women. She got out about 3 years later, and she was a hardened woman, and she met a lot of hard women in jail. And when she got out with her daughter Benita in tow, she needed to work, so she went in with Polly Adler, who was the premier madam at the time in New York City, who would write a book about her life and was the subject of a movie. But she had a number of houses of ill repute, let's put it that way. And Vivian did work for her for a time, but then she decided to go out on her own. She branched out, and by doing so, she became involved with gangsters like Legs Diamond, who was pictured here. He was a well-known guy at the time, well-known gangster and racketeer of the period. And he was sort of a handsome guy, and he was married, but he liked showgirls. And he had a famous girlfriend who actually, I think, came out of Massachusetts at one point originally. And he was known around town, and he partnered with Vivian in her blackmail business. She had basically a sexual extortion business where men would, be compromised in situations with women, and to avoid bad publicity, they would pay Vivian money or pay the women money, and that's the way that went. So she got a lot of money out of this, and some of it went to people like Legs Diamond. Arnold Rothstein was another character who Vivian supposedly dealt with. And Rothstein was really the brains of organized crime in the city at this period. And he was a master fixer of New York City. He could fix labor deals. He could fix gambling. And they say he fixed the World Series, the Black Sox scandal. So they provided money to a lot of operations, and a lot of mob bootleggers came to him for funding. Frank Costello being one of them, Lucky Luciano. And he did supposedly have a connection to Vivian, although that's been a little more difficult to nail down. Legs Diamond, yes. Rothstein, probably. But, it's hard. He's dead. Everybody's dead, in fact. Now, about this time, 1926, Jimmy Walker, the fun-loving mayor of New York City, won election, known as Bo James. And Jimmy, he had a reputation for really not working too hard in City Hall. He'd rather go to hang out in speakeasies and party with pretty showgirls himself. And his term of office coincided with the Jazz Age and Prohibition, and also the stock market frenzy of the period, which led eventually up to the Depression and the stock market crash. But Jimmy Walker was loved by everybody, certainly in the press. He didn't know Vivian, as far as we know, but she was there when he was running the city. And the city had sort of a laissez-faire attitude in terms of crime, which eventually would come back and sort of bite Walker, because he wasn't paying attention to his job. When times were good, Walker was the face of New York. Here he is with Amelia Earhart at a function, and he made trips abroad. He was the lucky, happy-go-lucky mayor, and he seemed to not do anything wrong, at least for a period of time. But by 1930, things were beginning to sour in New York City. You had the Depression taking hold. You had certain criminal elements causing problems. You had a famous case of Judge Crater, who disappeared in 1930. Now, he was a friend of, an associate of Vivian's, but he disappeared And he became the butt of jokes even today of where is Judge Crater. He's never been found, although we do have information that he was murdered because he was corrupt and it didn't do well on a deal. But with the Depression taking hold, organized crime causing problems, Rothstein being murdered, Walker was losing some of his appeal with the progressive elements in the city. And some blame Walker for this atmosphere of lawlessness that they were seeing in New York. And it wasn't sitting well. Yes, with the jazz age, things were great. Everybody was dancing and having a good time. But as 1930s came on, things were starting to sour. So much so that governor at the time, Governor Franklin Roosevelt, sensed he needed to do something about the stench of corruption that he was seeing in the city, particularly in the magistrate's court, where Vivian was ensnared in what she said was a fake prostitution case. And there was a long history of corruption where cops, judges, and prosecutors all profited. So Roosevelt initiated an investigation, and he tasked one Samuel Seabury, a former judge, to run the investigation. This is Seabury. He came from a long line of Episcopal clergy, and he was picked to lead the probe, and he did a job. I mean, he did uncover numerous cases of women being hit with false and fabricated charges of prostitution. 50, 60, maybe even 100 police officers were implicated. And it really was a stain upon law enforcement and New York City at the time. Vivian, of course, was watching all this in the newspapers play out. And she sensed that, hey, I was set up too. So maybe I should talk to Seabury and get him to look into my case. Now, she was, as this photo shows, she was at this time really not doing very well. Alcohol, drug abuse, financial issues were causing problems in her life. And she had lost custody of her daughter, Benita, from her previous husband. And she figured, well, let me go and see what I can tell Seabury's people. In February of 1931, this is where the story sort of picks up steam. She went to Seabury's office and she told them, look, I was set up in a prostitution case back in 1923. I have information and I want to tell you about it. And she told them some things. And, they said, well, fine, this is great. This is right in our wheelhouse, so to speak, but come back with more evidence to support your claim. And she said she would. But Vivian never made it back. Instead, Vivian was found, as this photo may indicate, in Van Cortlandt Park, strangled and beaten, and her body in a disheveled state. It was really kind of a crime that captivated the city. By doing so, when everybody saw that Vivian, the potential witness, was murdered, this is proof again that the city is in control of the criminal elements. Mayor Walker, you have to do something. This newspaper article shows you the way this is just a fraction of the newspaper coverage that was all over the city and all over the country at the time. Vivian's death was the tabloid story. You're all familiar with tabloid news stories. Well, this is one of them for that period. And it took off all over the place. The story also took off when Vivian's daughter, Benita, was so shamed by her mother's allegations and so shamed by her mother's life that she killed herself. She's 16 years old, living in Jersey with her father, birth father. So she killed herself. That created an even greater cry for something to be done about the lawlessness in New York City. We already had one investigation. So what was going to happen? Well, something had to be done. The cops jumped on the case. They said we were going to make an arrest. And eventually, the reformists were saying, Walker, you're not really doing the job. You got to do something. So Roosevelt expands his investigation to focus more on Walker's administration as a whole, not just the cops, but the way he runs his city government, the way he was getting money from people for not bribes, he said, but just because they were his friend. Now, how often have we heard that? But, that wasn't sitting well. That wasn't sitting well with the public, wasn't sitting well with the press, which was now turning against Walker because you had Vivian's death, you had her daughter's death, so something more had to be done. Well, the investigation, meanwhile, to Vivian's murder was going full speed, and Edward Mulrooney, the police commissioner, made it his personal project, and he investigated Vivian's murder. He had 60 detectives on the case. He had evidence he was developing himself from confidential informants. How often do you see a police commissioner in New York City actually do the investigation? Well, Mulrooney was doing it because he vowed that they would get a case, and in case they did. They focused on Vivian's attorney and former lover, John Radloff. He was implicated as a material witness, and ultimately he was not charged, but people thought he had something to do with it, since he was not only her lover, but also doing business deals with her. Mulrooney sought the help of limousine drivers all over the city. This is a leaflet that was given to limo drivers all over the city to say, hey, did you see this woman on a particular night, February 26th of 25th of 1931? And if so, come forward with information. This leaflet here describes the circumstances of Vivian's disappearance when her body was found, and became a call for the cops for more information. Mulrooney did his own investigation, and he got a tip from a fellow by the name of Noel Scaffa, who's seen here with legendary gangster, Frank Costello. Costello's on the left, Scaffa's on the right. Scaffa was a known jewel private investigator, meaning he would go out and investigate cases of stolen jewelry. And he became a very big name. But he approached Mulrooney through an intermediary and told him about this guy, Harry Stein, who was doing funny dealings with what looked like stolen jewelry from Vivian and also her stolen fur coat. So Stein became ground zero for the investigation, and he was arrested along with another fellow known as Sammy Greenberg. This newspaper photo shows Stein on the left and the rope used to strangle Vivian on the right. He was strangled with a cord. The cord was left on her neck. So Stein was brought to trial, and the cops thought they had a great case. They thought they had a locked case. They thought they had great witnesses. Well, in law enforcement, there never is a sure thing, because even after a big trial with a key witness and a lot of publicity, the jury acquitted Stein and Greenberg in the case, and wow, it was a big shocker. Stein, Greenberg acquitted. What happened? Well, good defense attorney, weakness of the main prosecution witness, and kind of, brought up the fact that, look, this witness is involved in the crime himself. How can you believe him? Not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, acquit him. And they did acquit him. Became a real sore point for Walker, for the police. But hey, what are you going to do? It just didn't work out that way. Case was an acquittal, and it stuck in the craw of law enforcement for decades. Now, Seabury, meanwhile, was looking into Walker, and he continued his investigation into 1932. This is after the acquittal in Vivian's murder case. And Walker was called as a witness to talk about his finances. Hey, you're getting money from all these people doing business with the city. What's this all about? And Walker was very combative, and he really, for a time, had the press's favor at this point. They really liked him. So they gave him the benefit of the coverage. But gradually over time, the paper started to turn against Walker, because how do you explain all of this money coming to you into various accounts? And, he really had no good explanation. He said it wasn't a bribe, but on the other hand, Roosevelt was watching this and saying, well, it wasn't a bribe. How do you explain this? It's not your salary. So at that point, Roosevelt convened his own investigation and called Walker as a witness. Now they hear, buddy buddies and better times here. But Roosevelt held a hearing and questioned Walker as well, his old political ally. So this was something that, the way politics turn, allies become your enemies. And it didn't look good for Walker. And it looked like Roosevelt was going to remove him from office. But on September 1st, 1932, Walker, knowing the way the political winds were blowing, and what his political allies were telling him, hey, you through, he decided he was going to resign, and he did so on September 1st, 1932, but insisting as he resigned that he did nothing wrong. But like what he often did in life with crises, he went on a vacation. And he went on a vacation, not with his wife, but with his girlfriend, Betty Compton. Now, Compton is not shown here. This is Walker with his wife, shown in a sort of White House visit earlier in their marriage. They were divorced in 1933. Walker would go on, take some sort of small business jobs. He liked the music industry, so he got a job in the music industry, but he really didn't go very far after that. And he died in 1946. And Harry Stein, well, he had other problems. Walker had problems, but Harry Stein had other problems. He escaped conviction for Vivian's murder, but he couldn't stay out of trouble. He was involved in an armed robbery of an armored car where the driver was killed. And in 1950, this happened. And he was tried, found guilty with two others, and sentenced to the electric chair, which we had in New York at that point. Appeals went on for 5 years, but finally the appeals ran out. They went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Stein and his two co-defendants were executed. And that was the end of Harry Stein. Karma sort of played out for him in a way I don't think he anticipated. Now, why am I showing you a plot of ground in the cemetery? Well, Vivian Gordon is buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. It was a funeral that was hastily put together, nobody attending apart from her grieving brother and the pallbearers. And her body was put into the ground in that grassy area just to the right of the stone that you see in the upper left-hand portion. It's unmarked. And I had a hell of a time trying to find out where Vivian was buried. So what did I do? I walked around the cemetery with a colleague who's a good cemetery spotter, and we couldn't find it. So finally, I determined that she wasn't buried under the name Vivian Gordon, but she was buried under the name, her married name, Benita Bischoff. So I said, okay, let's look for that stone. Well, we didn't find it because it's unmarked. So I said, well, ultimately we got a cemetery map, and to make a long story short, that's the plot where Vivian is buried. So I decided in doing this book that we have to do something. I think, here she is, a figure in New York political history of sorts, a murder victim, something of a cultural figure for the period. And here she is in an unmarked grave, as you see in this plot of grass here. So I've decided And I will be putting a simple marker there in the coming weeks to denote where she is at. And, you know, if anybody else is curious, historians or whatnot, you know, they can go there and see where she's buried. Everybody else involved in the case of note, Walker, Franklin Roosevelt, Seabury, you know, they all have their own memorials and burial places of note, but Vivian doesn't, and she will now in a few weeks. So I've made that decision. And I thought it was the right thing to do. And, you know, I got a book out of her life, so, you know, that's the least I thought I could do. Now, this is, if anybody is curious about what I do, this is my website right there. And I also have a Facebook page. Tony Destefano is the page. And, you know, anybody who wants to message me can either message me through the website or order books to the website even, or you could also message me in Facebook, which is also a good way of messaging. Now, this book really was a surprise for me in the sense that I didn't know she existed before I started work on a bigger story about Prohibition. Eventually, by doing a work on Prohibition, I discovered the story of Vivian. And Vivian, you know, one of these forgotten figures in history, but is now getting some recognition. My book's getting recognition. There's a fiction book out called Broadway Butterfly, but doesn't deal with Vivian. It deals with another woman from the era who was one of these butterflies, as they call them, Broadway butterflies. That means a woman who's attracted to the bright lights of Broadway, and if she's not careful, she'll get singed, either because of the company she keeps or because, you know, the business, the theatrical business, and Prohibition just sort of chews her up and spits her out. A lot of women had this fate in that period, and the newspapers are filled with stories about women who, you know, came to untimely ends because of, you know, the lives they had, and the lives were tough. And Vivian's life was probably emblematic of the worst that you could see. And so this is the story in a nutshell of Vivian Gordon. And if you enjoy the book, I hope you do, and I hope you buy it. You know, it's a story that is fast-paced. It's a good police procedural, but it also weaves in all of the elements of Prohibition, the Jazz Age, and ties it all together around the thread of Vivian's life. And that's essentially my Cliff Notes version of Broadway Butterfly. And I'd be happy to entertain, you know, any questions or remarks anybody would like to provide.
How do you
Over
go
to you,
about
Sue.
how do you go about getting a gravestone for an unmarked grave? Someone's asked.
Well, I had to go to the cemetery, and I had to do a ancestral search to find if there were any next of kin who were relevant in this whole chain of inheritance, and there weren't any. And I had to provide an affidavit to them. And I provided it, and they said, okay, if you want to do it, it's up to you. So I had to go find a monument company, which I found, and they provide me with a mocked up version of the stone. And that's how it happens. You know, it's a process. It took many months, by the way, because, you know, cemeteries, they have a lot of time. Authors don't have a lot of time, but it's happening.
Another question. Who would you cast as Vivian in a film version of your book? Very interesting question.
Interesting question. Gosh, I don't want to date myself. You know, it could be, that's a good question. I haven't thought of that.
About it. You can think about it. You don't have to answer it.
I'll have to think about it. I'll have to put it on my website if I ever do think about it. Or come up with a conclusion. I mean, it's got to be some actress who has some charisma or note today. I think that, possibly Catherine Narducci might be, but I don't know if she's of the right type.
Answer it, Tony. It's okay.
So that's I'd be groping for any more names. But
I'm
a good
sure.
question, very good question.
Here's another question. Did she ever have any legit jobs after losing custody of her daughter? And was she ever accused of extortion for her scams on any of her clients? There's two
Yeah,
questions there.
as far as we know, apart from the theatrical work, modeling work, she never had any legit jobs. She tried to break her daughter into the dancing and theater. That didn't work out. She was in the sex extortion business, and that's what happened. Yes, she did get accused of it. She had the 1923 case where she was convicted, which she said was a frame-up. And she had a couple of other civil cases where she was accused of extortion. But those cases really didn't go anywhere. They tend to sort of drop by the wayside. And so to answer your question, yes, one conviction, but in terms of anything further, in terms of the extortion issue, no.
Just gonna check real quick. Very interesting, fascinating, so sad. Some questions. The presentation was very interesting. Anyway, anybody I have a couple people in the audience have a question. Yes.
What do we know about her daughter and where she's married and anything about her ex-husband?
Did you hear that?
No, I didn't hear it all.
They're asking, do you know where her daughter's buried and what happened and anything about the ex-husband?
Yeah, the daughter Benita is buried. She had a big funeral, and she is buried in I believe Pennsylvania now, and there's no question about where she is. But there was a second part to that question.
The second part was, do you know what happened to the husband, her former husband?
He died in 1936. He's buried in Pennsylvania as well, in natural causes.
Interesting. They weren't buried together. What challenging part of writing this book?
Well, the challenge, of course, in these kinds of cases, these books, is getting information, good information from reliable sources. Everybody central to this story is deceased. From Roosevelt, Vivian, everybody else in between. So what do? Well, you go into the old newspaper archives, which is easier to do today because a lot of it's digitized, and you follow the coverage. You get coverage from the August New York Times and their take on it. And they did a lot of coverage on this. To the tabloids, Daily News, the Sun, and other papers all over the place, England, Canada, and you get it all together and you look for commonality, and you get the facts, and you also have to look at the political landscape. So you have to go into the political stories of the time, about Roosevelt, about Walker, about the police department, and you really got to stitch this together in a way where you don't get too bogged down in the minutia, but you keep the story moving. And this is a police story, basically. It's a murder story. And it was sensational at the time. So you're going to get that kind of coverage. Nobody alive today. There's nobody to ask about firsthand information. So you have to rely on secondary sources. You also rely on court records. There are some court records that exist. And those are, important. They help fill in the blanks on some of this stuff. So it's very challenging, but that makes it interesting because, it tests your ability as a researcher, as a journalist, as a writer, to craft a story. And that's basically, it's not easy.
It sounds like your other books were a little easier, like your Gotti's Boys, and those were a little easier to write about because you had more information available to you? Or?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, these mafia cases, these mafia books are easier because in many of them, I was able to sit through various trials. So I had basically a timeline in my head already about what to write about. And I knew where the information was. I heard people testify firsthand. There were tapes, there were recordings, or other people, prosecutors, and even judges who were willing to be interviewed, families, members who were willing to be interviewed. So that was helpful because in the mafia cases, you can pull all this together. And a lot of the information comes from contemporaneous sources and people who are still alive today. So that made those books were actually easier to do because of the vast amount of live and current information and living sources. Vivian's story was a challenge because everybody's deceased.
We have a couple more questions, and one of you have the question I was going to ask, but before I'm going to skip and go back, so I don't want you to think the person that wrote that I'm ignoring you. Someone asked, was the husband involved at all in any of her criminal actions?
As far as we know, no, because he was a guy who worked as an accountant for what was then the federal prison system. So he was seemed to be a straight-laced guy. He didn't have any dealings with her shady, sexual extortion dealings, because don't forget, Vivian abandoned the husband, left the husband about 1920 and went to New York. And that's where she was doing her thing. He was in Virginia or Philadelphia doing his, legitimate job. So I don't think he had nothing to do.
The question that I skipped over, and it's one I have too. What else? What's the next book? What are you working on next? Anything? Or?
Well, there are a couple of ideas I'm kicking around. I have a book I'm dealing that's going to be off the Lufthansa case, that fabled 1978 heist. One of the key figures in that case. So I just started working on that. So that's going to be a while. That's going to be a while to get that together. That has similar challenges. Some of the people are deceased, but there's an incredible court record, and some of the people are still alive. So, we're going to play off that. I did an earlier book called The Big Heist, which was about the Lufthansa case. And some of that information is transferable to the new project. So, hey, it's going to be work, but that's what we do. It's fun to get it all together.
We have some more questions here. I gotta, hold on. I gotta scroll down. People want to know what you won your Pulitzer and Emmy for.
The Pulitzer, I was part of a team of Newsday reporters who covered the 1990, I think it was 1991 subway crash in Manhattan, where 5 people died. And I did a story. It's funny. I tell journalism students this all the time. I didn't want to work on that story. And I said, well, since you have legal background, I'm an attorney. You have to write the legal story about the crash. Who's liable? Okay. I wrote the story. And lo and behold, it became part of the Pulitzer package.
That's nice.
That's how it happened. The Emmy was for, we did a documentary about the Gilgo Beach murders, which I think you may know about up there. These 10 women who were killed on Long Island in the early 2000 period. And they've just indicted this guy, Rex Uriman, for their murders. But we did a documentary about that on the 10th anniversary of the murders, which would have been 2021. And that's what we got the Emmy on.
Okay. 2, is the mob still dangerous and prevalent in the New York area?
The mob still exists in the New York area. We still have the 5 families, although basically it's down to really 4 credible families. A lot of the old bosses are dead or in jail. And a lot of people don't want to be a boss because that brings a lot of scrutiny. But they still exist. Certain families are doing better than others. Genovese family, to some extent the Gambino family. They're into business rackets, construction rackets. They're not killing each other like they used to. In fact, we haven't seen a mob-related murder probably since about 1999 in the New York City.
Oh,
Go to Canada, you'll see it's something. That's a different story. But the mob is still around, but it's weakened. It's sort of metamorphosized into this more secretive organization because they realize that just too many informants around. You got to be careful about what you say.
did you contact Vivian's brothers, possible her, like, is her family with her relatives? Did you, or any of Vivian? I'm elaborating on this question. The question she wrote is, did you contact her brothers? I think she meant to say possible family, or he meant to say, or someone's meant to say possible family.
The question is, I tried to locate them, and her sisters or 2 sisters, certainly her parents are gone, the daughter's gone, and her brother's gone. So there's nobody to reach out to. And the brother had no children as far as we know. So.
Okay. Yeah, wow. That would be a challenge to write this.
Yeah.
The audience, anything? I just want to make sure I have my head down. Anybody else? Zoom, okay, we do have some more questions. Thank you. All right, hold on. Stein or the other guy have heard of Gambino and Genovese. Did I say it right? Families.
Genovese.
Yep. Do the mobs resent the ethnic gangs? Do anything to limit their reach? Do they do anything? I think is what they're trying to say, to try to reach. And forgive me, everybody. I'm trying to read your questions, and I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. I'm trying to do the best I can. Do the mobs resent the ethnic gangs? Let's go with that first.
Well, that's a good question, actually, because over recent history, the Albanian gangs have been particularly headstrong and combative with some of the Italians. And there's been a lot of bad blood. So there's actually been fighting between them. The Italians think that the Albanian gangs are crazy, and the Albanians think that some of the older Italian mobsters are pushovers. So there's that tension going on. In terms of the ethnic gangs, like the Asian organized crime, there really isn't any contact between the Italians and the Chinese, except maybe on particular drug cases. There was a Italian mafia drug connection with black organized crime over the years, but I don't see that's current anymore. But the Albanians clearly have been a problem for the Italians.
How does fit into all this?
Say again?
How do the cartels? We keep hearing about the cartels anymore. That's the.
Yeah, the cartels really take the game and push it to another level. There's so much money in drugs that the cartels have more money coming in the Italian organized crime. Italians, yeah, some of them deal with drugs. The mafia has been dealing with drugs unofficially for decades. But the cartels have pushed it to another level, as you've seen. What's happened, of course, is that the Sicilian and Italian organized crime elements are working with the American organized crime elements to facilitate drug deals and other illicit deals. But they're nowhere near what the cartels do in terms of income, in terms of the drug product they move. The Sicilians will deal with the cartels, but The Americans, not so much.
What about the Russian gang influence? Somebody would just asked.
The Russian gangs in the late 1970s, 1980s were a factor in New York. They had some major characters, but they were neutralized by prosecutions. And the fact that they were kind of disorganized, they really didn't have a cohesiveness that the Italians had. They got arrested. Some of them went to jail. They were into a lot of healthcare rackets, some cigarette rackets, some fuel oil rackets. They're not a factor today in New York City like they used to be. The Russians, this is.
I'm smiling because someone has asked, is that a cat that's sound asleep behind you? Is that a cat behind
Yes,
you?
it is. It is. She's the home office manager.
I didn't even notice, and then that's how I started. I know, and then I asked about the Russian gangs, and it's like, why is that funny? Well, I wasn't laughing at that question. I was laughing at the
Yeah, she's
sleeping
resting.
through the whole thing. It's great. Yeah, I've talked to a few authors, and the cats walk across the keys while they're trying to do the program and everything else. So that's good. Your cat's
She sleeps. She sleeps during the day.
Yeah.
During the day.
Just taking one last look. Yes, we have another question here. Are there Italian cartels? Only heard of ones relating to South America or Mexico.
Well, you know, the Italian cartels, you'd have to go back to Italy, to Sicily and southern Italy to see where that is. There are some very powerful mafia families in Italy. The Androgata, the Camorra. Do they have cartel relationships among themselves? Meaning, are they organized in a way where a lot of groups come together? I don't know, because I'm not an expert in that area of Italy. But it's quite possible. But they're under siege as well over there. The Italian police and law enforcement have been making cases in the last couple of years against the Italian organized crime. So, you know, they've got their hands full.
Anybody else? Anything? I've got to go look up your other books now, because you've got quite a variety of different books that you've written, and I appreciate that you took the time this afternoon to chat with all of us. Thank you so much for,
Oh, you're quite well, quite well. It was fun. I like answering the questions from readers and the public. These books, in some ways they write themselves, particularly if you know the case. But they all sort of follow this organized crime thread. And some of it's an education for me, because I really wasn't familiar with Prohibition in the Jazz Age period, which is its own period of crime, as I was with the more modern period, say from World War II onward. So it's been an eye-opener. Vivian's book, this Broadway Butterfly, is really an eye-opener. It's really pulled together a lot of strands of history around this woman's very short, unfortunate life.
You said you stumbled on her story because you were researching the Prohibition era. Was that for another book or just your own curiosity?
No, I was doing a story for I work for Newsday newspaper, and I was doing a story about Prohibition on Long Island. And in doing that, you got to go into the whole story of Prohibition. So I came across it, the murder, in one of those newspaper articles I saw. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. You put it aside, and then you go back to it later. That's how I found it. I mean, it was for a newspaper story, but it was like almost collateral. It wasn't something I was looking for.
Good thing you stumbled on it.
Yeah, well, really.
Everyone is saying thank you. Very interesting. we really appreciate, again, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and we all wish you success, and looking forward to a future book from you. And like I said, I'm going to look into your other books. Thank
No,
you so much,
Thank you
Tony.
all. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.
Everybody, thanks for joining us today. Really good. Nice round of applause. And I hope you'll join us again for another program. Thanks.
I hope so. Thank
Thanks
you.
again, Robert. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for helping.
Yep. Bye.